Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places, filling all things, come into wellness, cleanse every sin, save our souls, O gracious Lord.
Amen.
All right, so obviously we've been gone for a while, so let's begin by recapping just a little bit and bringing Maria Canella up to speed on where we are. So what was the last two sections that we talked about?
We did the fallen world and our spiritual struggle. In the previous class.
Oh,
And
we
this
didn't start on faith?
We started with On the Faith for this class.
Ah, okay. All right. So let's go ahead and begin then on faith.
Okay.
And which of you would like to begin?
You can start that if you want.
Okay. I highlighted Maxim 6. Specifically, every living thing seeks love, man, animals, and plants. All people seek God and long for him, regardless of whether they are believers or unbelievers. Some people call themselves atheists, but they do not know that in their hearts they long after God. I thought that was, that's something that comes up in a lot of writings, some of it more philosophically rooted than this, which seems to get right to the matter. But in speaking about our human nature and how essentially our fulfillment is in God, and we're tricked into other things, and that's essentially what happened in the fall. We were tricked into looking at the material world only.
Right, and this is, I think, the heart of Christian ethics and ethics in general. This is where Aristotle was going with when he basically looked at the idea of what's going to make me happy, what is going to ultimately bring me joy. And so everyone, atheist, Christian alike, they're all trying to fill that void and not understanding why it's not there, because ultimately we're longing for what is really going to fill that void, what is really going to give us lasting, real happiness, and that is our communion with God. And that really finding love is the key element to it. So many times we see the tragic realities of a world where individuals did not receive love and how that devastated their upbringing. And ultimately that they're still seeking after God. I thought that was good too, because the reality is that I love how he, delineates that there's really no such thing as an atheist. It's moronic in a sense, because everyone somehow believes in a higher power, whether they want to admit it or not.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's hard to argue that atheists don't exist, right? Because I meet them all the time. But it's almost as if they just don't believe in a God that actually doesn't exist. Like, they don't believe in the very same God that we don't believe in. They believe in some caricature that's been presented to them at some point. And so,
well, I think that it goes deeper than that. I think that the reality is that everyone believes in God, just not the same God, in the sense that, whether they want to call, praying to a deity God, they've made science into a God, they've made money into a God, they've made societal rules into a God, without realizing that by making those idols, they've made false gods, and they call it atheistic, and yet it is subjugation, it is bowing down to something. So this is why I do agree with the idea that there really isn't, quote unquote, an atheist. It's basically you're either for God or against God, but ultimately you exist in this world, and you therefore submit yourself in part of your human nature to something. Forgive me, I'm going to kill my dog. Out you go. He wants in, he wants out. He wants in, he wants out. All right. Maria Canella, what was a section of this that you really enjoyed?
I enjoyed Maxim 7,
Mm-hmm.
about how there will be no sleeping until the second coming of Christ. How can the soul sleep? And that the soul is always awake and active. I don't know. It was just very interesting to me to like think about how our souls are always alert, but then our bodies have to rest. So I was like, well, I wonder what is our soul doing during this time of sleep? I guess that was what I was thinking about.
Well, this is the thing that is interesting, because this is why oftentimes we encourage ourselves to pray against satanic fantasies in our sleep, because ultimately, because our body is sleeping, we are vulnerable. And, you know, not all sleep is quote unquote just REM and, you know, synapses firing off and just giving you weird visions. You can be under spiritual attack, and people have had sinful dreams that they wake up from and feel violated from, because it seemed like such a real dream. But because the soul is active, continuously active, it is still experiencing its spiritual warfare and spiritual development. This is one of the things that is very important for the soul after death, is because so many people seem to think that the soul is just asleep and dormant and just, you know, either waiting for the resurrection or just somehow like not there or gone. I think this is one of the elements as to why there's so much sadness and death, when the reality is that the soul is still active and continuous.
Yeah, so then I guess too, like with there, I think we all have dreams that just don't make sense and they don't affect us good or bad. Is that always supposed to mean something, or is it always supposed to be the evil one trying to attack us, or is it just
No, the reality is, and Saint Paisios, or excuse me, Porphyrios talks about this in his work Wounded by Love, when he compares us to antennas, that we're able to get signal, we're able to see things. But the reality is we don't know where that signal's coming from. There have been times where people have had experiences in their dreams that were totally life-changing, life-altering. I mean, Saint Romanos, it was in a dream that he encountered the Virgin Mary, who made him eat the contacchio. So the abbot of the monastery of Saint Ephrosynos was in a dream when he encountered Saint Ephrosynos, who gave him the apples. So within dreams, good things happen too. It's not just evil. The problem is that it's very, very hard for us to have the spiritual discernment to basically say which is which. And this is why the church fathers, by and large, tell us that we are to ignore dreams, to not give them mind, to not give them meaning, because it's almost like going to a soothsayer. It's like, okay, what did it mean? I saw a woman in a black dress in my dreams, so that must mean A, B, or C. Someone died in my dreams, so that means this must mean something good is going to happen to these individuals. So the person was wearing white in my dream, so therefore they're going to have trouble. People look for meaning in dreams, and that can be, you know, dangerous and put us down roads that take us away from the truth. If that makes sense.
I think like I guess what I was asking too, for like dreams that, for like, I'll have a dream sometimes that I didn't go to math all semester and I haven't been in school for 12 years. So I mean that I don't really, I'm just like, oh, okay, whatever, it was a dream, but I don't really interpret it as it came from like the evil one or from God, you know what I mean? So there are dreams like that that are just, they're just, right? Or
right. And a lot of times, you know, dreams are part of our brain because our brain doesn't turn off, and we're just, you know, I remember when I was first working as a registrar of the Metropolis of Chicago, I went to bed and I dreamed I was still entering data into the registry. because you're thinking about it. You're thinking about it. Sometimes, if you're anxious about something, an old anxiety comes up, and just because you're still thinking about it. They've even done studies to show that certain types of food can affect how and what you dream.
Sure.
So yeah, some dreams are just that. It's just your brain still going on, or your brain reacting to chemical stimuli because of certain foods that you ate.
Everyone I've ever known has had a dream where they have to take a final or something and they have never been to the class also. Like everyone I've ever met. I have a variation on that dream where the stack of newspapers is delivered to my front door. It's like when I was a newspaper carrier. And I'm like 35 years old and I have no idea who to deliver the papers to anymore. It's like, it's at my door.
And I think personally, I mean, not that, again, shouldn't be doing this because I just said don't interpret dreams, but I just think that that's part of our anxieties of whatever we're dealing with in life now. It's just, because the brain's a computer, it doesn't forget. So it goes back to those moments of anxiety and pulls up a familiar scenario that kind of plays out that anxiety in your head, whether current or past. Since we are missing 2 of our classes, the Coles are a little busy tonight, so they are unable to come, and the Tobiases are at another person's house, so they are not able to come. So we can either go forward into the next section, or we can delve into another point each for on faith.
I think we could do another point each.
Okay.
What do you think, Ed?
Sure. Number 9, I really liked too, just the first part of it. We have all been baptized in Christ our Lord, but we are only formal Christians. We are not as God wants us to be. We read books, but we do not understand. All of those things about, the idea of belief as just a mere assent, and all of the formalities and all of those things, as opposed to changing your life existentially and how the Lord is actually moving you in all sorts of arenas of your life. But I don't want to discount the formality points either, because those are really important touchstones for whatever you're dealing with in life. I mean, you can always kind of return to the sacraments and those formal aspects of the faith that I think he's talking about. But there's something in here that maybe you can draw out.
Well, he's touching on the idea that the sacramental reality is present, but if we do not participate in it, then it loses its substance. To be baptized and then have nothing past that does not fulfill what the baptism is supposed to be, and that's where he says basically it's a formalized. So, you're not actually enacting the baptism. You're not enacting philosophy, and so the idea is that it's looking almost like this Neoplatonistic concept of the crux of ideas, and then the reality falling short of that. So, for example, the concept of, you've probably heard the example chairness. Both of you have heard that before?
I've read what?
Chairness, like basically the idea that if you got rid of every single chair in the world, you would still know what a chair is, right?
Sure.
And by that same token, anything can be a chair. You've got a rock, now that's my chair. There's a table, well, I'm sitting on it, now it is my chair. And so it's the concept of ideas having more permanence, having more substance than an item. And so there's this idea of archetype, where all of your mind goes back to this archetype of what something is. And so this idea of the way, the truth, and the life, the bread of life, all these things point to this idea of philosophy, of loving truth, but none of them actually are truth. None of them actually are the reality of that actualized, which is our Lord Jesus Christ. And so everything is basically a shadow. Everything is elusive. And so when we look at these things, we have to understand that, okay, it's basically a subset. This is one of the reasons why you've heard me sometimes say that we aren't really human, we're subhuman. And the reason why we're subhuman is not because of lessness of our physical species, but rather the fact that we are supposed to be like Christ. Christ is the measure of what it means to be a human being now. And when we do not live up to that potential, which is our capability with his grace and help, then we are not enacting this. This is like the idea that all bread is not real bread. The only real bread is the Eucharistic host. And all drink is not real drink. It is a pale comparison to what is real drink, which is the blood, the wine in the holy gifts. So this idea that everything that we're talking about is formalized, it's that it is not actualized. It is not participating in the fullness of it. And as such, everything becomes less than. Marie Canella?
I also like number 11. I think it was just kind of a good reminder that God is in control. So we have not committed ourselves to the will of God. We believe that everything is in our hands and that we must decide about everything that God has other things to do in the world. But I also like how it closes with, as for anything in chaos, God knows why it is like that and why he has permitted it. He sets the limits. We must know it is that he is present everywhere. So like watching the news can be very depressing sometimes, or every day actually. So just trying to understand that God allowed these things, like he has a reason, there's a master plan. Like this was just a good reminder to read this maxim.
This is very true. It can often seem that within all the chaos, within all of the hullabaloo of the world, that, oh my God, is God even paying attention? And the reality is, like, yes, he's paying minute attention. We'll get to a little bit of that when we go into the next section, because there's a certain passage about St. Catherine that I found just absolutely mind-blowing. But the reality is that God sees and understands everything to the big picture. And sometimes we look and say, well, but, like, for example, if somebody dies, it's like, but they died. So what? Are we really only focused on this life to not understand that sometimes death leads to perfection? For example, today, before Bible study, I was going to visit a shut-in. And when I got there, the shut-in was indisposed. They could not see me yet. So I had to wait in the hallway. The nurse told me, well, it'll be about 20 minutes. I said, okay, well, fine. So I just sat and played with my phone, looked at news stories. And then I heard one of the residents at the nursing home say, Father, Father. I said, yes. And the person said, can I give you confession? And I said, you can, but full disclosure, I'm an Orthodox priest. And he said, I'm Orthodox too. I'm Russian. I was like, oh. So I go in there, he gives me his confession. And I thought to myself, this was ordained. This was how it was supposed to be. God arranged it so that I would not be in the room with the person I went to see, that I would be in the hallway for this person to receive the sacrament of confession. So God does not necessarily cause things, but he allows things to transpire so that his will can be done to the glory of God and for the salvation of the world. It seems messy, but it is there. And so when we trust in that, when we can have faith in that, it frees us from a lot of the anxieties. This is when he says that we don't trust God, we don't have faith in God. To be able to trust back and say, you know what, he's going to catch it. Nothing, it doesn't matter. It's going to be okay. And this segues very much into this concept of inner peace that he goes on to. Speaking of, Maria, do you want to start with this one?
Sure. I was also drawn to the maxim on St. Catherine.
You know exactly where I was going with that, didn't you?
Yeah. And it was this part specifically that really drew me in was how can that be, O Lord, when my heart is impure and full of evil and pride? Yes, said the Lord, but you have left room in it for me. Had I not been with you, you would not have been able to bear all these tortures. I will give you strength so that you can endure until the end. To me, it just blew my mind that Saint Catherine in this time was just talking about her heart being full of evil and pride. Um, I mean, it's like she was honing in on her what she felt were her vices and things that she needed to work on, but she still also had room for God.
And this is important because when we look at some of these spiritual giants, and even this is one of the reasons why Elder Thaddeus feels so accessible, because you see his own spiritual struggles. So you don't think about you hear about her physical tortures, you don't even think about the mental battle that St. Catherine was going through. And you can imagine when she's talking about the evil and pride, why would she be prideful? If you just bested the best 100 philosophers and scholars of the known world, you might just be a little bit proud. Um, and to say, why is this happening to me? And so for Jesus Christ to acknowledge, like, yeah, you do have those things, but you left room for me, is just absolute. Yeah, it blows your mind, because you think that's incredible. That is what allows us to do it, is if we have left him room. This is why the art of kenosis is so important. Kenosis is the spiritual art of self-emptying, to not allow ourselves to be full to the brim. There was a story, I'm trying to remember which father told it. It may have been in the A.R.E, where an individual came to a monastery, and part of the monastery's traditions is that they welcome guests and they feed them lukumi, which are those like sugary Turkish delights, as I think is what they're known as in America, and a liqueur or wine. And so the abbot asked this visitor, who was dressed to the nines, like Louis Vuitton, Hugo Boss. I mean, he looked decked out, and asked him, "Would you like a glass of wine?" And the man said, "Yes." So the abbot started pouring the wine, and the man said, "Thani, that's enough. That's enough." Right about when the wine was about a third up, the typical place where you'd stop for a glass of wine. The abbot kept pouring, and the man said, "Stop, stop, stop!" Kept pouring. It goes over the lip of the glass. "Stop!" Keeps pouring. It spills over the table, gets all over his clothes, all over his shoes, and he said, "What is this? You've ruined everything. You've ruined it." And the abbot looked at him and said, "You're just like that glass. You can't take anything else anymore either. You're too full. You need to empty yourself, and then God can come into you." And so if we do not allow God in, then there's no way that we can grow. He's not going to force the issue. And that's why kenosis, self-emptying, is such a powerful, powerful thing. And to see that even St. Catherine was struggling with that, even in her time of great martyrdom, in her moment of her glory, essentially. And for Christ to say, "But because you left room for me, I will get you through this to the end." Absolutely powerful. But this is what stillness is. This is how we, acquire it, to understand that peace is so important. That can only be achieved with Christ's help, not by our own will. Dr. Edward?
Number 13. It seemed to be, it was a very practical point that he starts with, and then he moves into vigilance in general. It says, if at first we believe that we are about to say something to someone's benefit, but then, after we use our discernment, we decide that our words will only hurt that other person, it is better to remain silent. And I can say that this advice is something I should have followed probably many times. But the idea of then, expanding that out into just using discernment in general, and then vigilance is in knowing what is going on, what your thoughts are, before just letting them out. Keeping a watch over your heart, keeping a watch over your mind and your thoughts.
In a lot of my pastoral guidance to individuals, this comes up a lot. The idea of being vigilant, to understand when something is coming out of our mouth that is not necessarily healthy or holy, and to pump the brakes, take a moment, go, wait, is this something that I really want to say? So that discernment, that vigilance of understanding that. And discernment is something that I really want to tease out just a little bit. The accuracy is the Greek word for it, and it is actually one of the highest virtues that we can acquire. Because if you have discernment, what is essentially discernment? Discernment is the ability to understand the difference between something that is good and something that is evil. And a lot of times we don't have it. And by having discernment, it allows us to see our own sins. And that's why it's such a high gift. That's why it's very, very high on the spiritual totem pole. Our hierarchy of needs is discernment, to say, where am I lacking? What am I having problems with? And because if you have that, then you can actually look at your thoughts. You can look at what you're about to say and have that discernment to say, wait a second, this could harm. It's better to pull back. Absolutely incredible. And that is what you, like you said, we oftentimes lack that discernment, that vigilance to say, wait, stop talking. Because what's going to happen is that we're going to cause harm. We're going to cause pain in the individual. This is not beneficial to them. All it's doing is trying to make me seem like I'm proving my point, to score a win, as opposed to actually bringing the person closer to realizing the point. So instead of bringing peace, it is bringing discord, and that is extremely important. Extremely important. Discernment and vigilance are two of the highest things that we really need to have, because throughout this entire chapter he talks about how incredibly important it is to just, once you've got inner peace, don't let it go. And throughout the chapter you see how everyone says, yeah, easier said than done. But if we have discernment and vigilance, then it's easier to be able to keep that elusive peace in the pen, as opposed to allowing it to run out with the whims of the world. Absolutely powerful. Absolutely.
So that discernment and the vigilance, it seems very related to, your own thoughts and your own heart, your own motivations. But there's an element, maybe you can speak to this, about, the words you saying may be proper and right, but knowing the state of the person that you're speaking to, maybe it would be imprudent to say this to them knowing that they can't receive it in a certain way. Is that also part of discernment, or is that?
It is, especially, and this is one of the reasons why I always advise somebody, if you have to write something serious to somebody, it's good to get your thoughts out on paper and then wait 2 days, read it again, and not just for the idea of a proofreader to go, oh, I found a typo, but after you've given it 2 days of prayer and time to look at it again and go, that's a little harsh. That's a little arrogant on my part to say it that way. Because ultimately you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to gain? What are you trying to accomplish with your thought, with your action, with your interaction? And so discernment is being able to tease that out and say, okay, this is where I want us to go. This is where I want us to get by the end of this conversation. If we don't have discernment, if we don't have that vigilance of keeping ourselves on track, then it can get completely out of whack. So Yeah, and these are two virtues that on every single level, whether it's our thoughts or just conversing in general, we have to have that vigilance. And even more so when we get heated, when we get upset, when the weather is stormy, as it says in another place, to be aware that, okay, what's going on? Why is it happening? To say, I'm upset, and then to look outside, it's gray. It's like, oh, I'm upset because it's gray. I'm not going to let that take me out of my prayerful peace. All right, Maria Canellas, a second one.
Number 12 was kind of describing how the evil one can also give you a sense of peace.
Mm-hmm.
You can perceive it to be something that's from God. I think this one scared me a little bit because I mean, I guess that can really happen to any of us, and it would be hard maybe to decipher where your peace is coming from.
This is very, very true. And this is why I've used the example when I've said for a dream. So you have two dreams. One came from Satan, one came from God. One dream made you feel very, very peaceful, very, very happy. Everything's fine, everything's good, everything's in control. And the other dream, pardon my expression, scared the hell out of you.
Mm-hmm.
You were terrified. You woke up in a cold sweat. Which one came from God? Which one came from the devil? As a general rule. Not saying specific, but just as general.
The one that gives you peace is a false peace from the evil one.
Exactly. Whereas the scary dream, what is it telling you? It's basically saying, change. You need to change. Change, or this bad thing could happen. Whereas a false peace, it basically goads you into complacency, laziness, and self-righteousness. And so this is why it's important, because Jesus Christ said, peace I give you, not as the world gives you. So there's a different kind of peace. And so it is important for us to understand, where is that peace coming from? Because the peace that the world comes is basically a calm between storms. Okay, things aren't happening to you right now, and you think, oh, it's peaceful. That's not the same peace as communion with God and feeling his love and his connection and the connectivity between you and all of creation, which in and of itself can, ebb and flow too. But the peace of the devil is, okay, things are going well right now, and then they're not going well, and then they are going well, and put you on this roller coaster of emotions when it's really not peace at all. Because after all, he gave you anxiety. He can remove it just slightly. So you're right. It's important to understand, where is that peace coming from? And that's why prayerfully, it's important to say, okay, I'm praying to understand my peace, to have that peace. And that's why the line at the end from St. Isaac the Syrian of this point, preserve your inner peace at any cost. Do not trade your inner peace for anything in the world. Make peace with yourself, and heaven and earth will make peace with you. That was one of my favorite parts of this chapter. The idea that, because oftentimes we think, well, I could have peace if they would just let me have peace. Mm-hmm. Well, the reality is, it's not them that's the problem. I have to have peace in myself. And if I can acquire that peace, then that peace will transcend me into them. Basically not giving them a foothold to walk over.
What would be the benefit of the evil one giving you a false sense of peace?
The benefit to him is that it does not allow you to change.
So you
by keeping you
further, basically.
Right, by keeping you in a perpetual flux of things are okay, things are bad, it gives you a false sense of contentment. Okay. And if you have that, then you're not changing, you're not moving. You're not getting closer to people. And this is why you can see people that seem very, very quote unquote content, and peaceful, but they're also alone. And not alone in the way of the monastics alone, they're just alone. And living a life that is not of benefit to them, the world, or bringing them closer to God. That's false. And it's lonely. And ultimately that loneliness, ekes out years later. They realize, oh my God, my life. What have I done with my life? I thought I was happy. That almost sounds like one of those like Hallmark movies where at the end the guy's like, and then he found true love. Doctor, did you have a second one?
I just wanted to follow up on this. We've been talking a lot about dreams, and I'm wondering what the, personally, I rarely remember my dreams, and I don't have recurring dreams. But in a case, I mean, you said it's recommended. Ignore dreams. That's what's recommended by spiritual fathers. Is it typical for someone, only when they've been having the same dream and to bring it to their spiritual father, or how do our dreams typically handled by monastics or by other, priests?
It depends on the spiritual acumen of the spiritual father. Every priest has different gifts, and just as every person has different gifts. We know that dreams do mean things. We know that they are important. I mean, you just look at the Old Testament in Genesis. Genesis, when Joseph, had interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh and all the people that he encountered. So we know that dreams do have a meaning. But what did Joseph have? He had the charisma, the charisma, the spiritual gift of interpreting dreams. Not everyone has that. Not everyone has the ability to do that. So at most of the time, I would imagine that some spiritual fathers would give an educated guess. They would pray that the Holy Spirit would enlighten them to basically either say, it's probably this, or it's something that I don't know and you should probably ignore. There have been times where some of my individuals have come to me with their dreams, and I've been able to very clearly, based on the context of what they've told me and what the dream said, where it's the devil's messing with you. Where, for example, let's say that you're struggling to love a certain person, and a dream occurs where that person is hurting you. Well, that's very clearly from the devil getting you to feel justified in your hatred towards that person. So that's fairly common to be able to say. So I would just say, do use your gut on that. If you find that a dream is bothering you and you need to bring it to the church, then bring it to the church, bring it to your spiritual father, with the hope that the Holy Spirit will enlighten the priest in that moment to give you the right answer. But that's again going back to the trust and the faith that God will be the one to give the right answer.
Can I ask a side question unrelated to this book? So Joseph in the Old Testament, and then Joseph in the New Testament was also a dreamer.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking recently, especially in this Advent season, we've been sending out Christmas cards, and one of them has a nice icon of the Nativity on it. Mm-hmm. On this one, it's not typical for most, but in the card that we're sending out, Saint Joseph doesn't even have a halo, whereas Mary does, the Theotokos, Christ child, some of the angels. And I'm wondering why it seems like in the Greek tradition, at least, maybe all of Orthodoxy, that Saint Joseph is kind of more of a side character, and he's not necessarily. I mean, you rarely see an individual icon of Saint Joseph, right?
Well, let's look at the character of Joseph, because this is something that drives me crazy personally. You look at the nativity sets and you see Joseph, and he's got this dark brown hair, and it's like, oh, the perfect family. Like, you even see some people using it as the young immigrant family, when the reality was that Joseph was much older than the Virgin Mary. Some reports say that he was 60 at the youngest, 80 at the oldest. He had grown children with their own families by the time that he was betrothed to the Virgin Mary. We know that Jude, Yaakov, Salome, and I think two others were his children. So part of Jesus' disciples were actually his half brothers and sisters. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Joseph was much older. Now, what do we see about Joseph? We see that in the entire New Testament, Joseph doesn't say one word. In the entire nativity story, he doesn't say anything. Everything is said from the point of view of the angels. And so what is that doing? It's basically telling us that Joseph had a purpose. His purpose was to protect the Christ child, to defend him, to take him from point A to point B, to make sure nothing bad happened to him. And so he was guardian of both the child and Mary. So that's his role. Now, within the Orthodox Church, we see him as a very important person because he has an epithet that is not given to very many people. Vicious, righteous, the righteous Joseph. And by saying that he is righteous, there is a certain understanding of this word that it is not just. People can be just, but they're not necessarily holy. Righteous is tip top of the spiritual barometer. So even though Joseph doesn't say a single word, it shows us that he is considered extremely important, extremely righteous in the life of the church. It is also possible that he does not have a halo in those icons, because what we are seeing a lot of times in the nativity icons in particular, we see Joseph in the midst of his doubts. Yeah. Oftentimes you'll see right next to Joseph usually a shepherd wearing very scraggly clothes, and in my opinion it's done correctly when you're only seeing a profile of that shepherd with one eye hidden. And the reason why this is because who is that shepherd? Satan. And the reason why it is in profile and not both eyes is because the eyes are the windows to the soul. So by basically only showing one, we're seeing the duplicitous nature of the devil that is trying to say, oh, you should divorce this person. So Joseph, in this case, would not be seen with a halo, kind of in the same way that a lot of icons of the disciples pre-Pentecost don't necessarily show them with halos. That being said, I have seen icons with Joseph with a halo. There is a nativity icon, for example, that has the Christ child in the middle in the manger, and then both Mary and Joseph on either side kneeling and basically worshiping him as the Christ child, with halos up around both of them to show that their mindset is focused on what that is. Because what does the halo mean? The halo means that their mind is centered on God, centered on the heavenly, and that's reflected in that. So that's my qualm with nativity set pieces. With the last 10 minutes, do we want to go forward into the spiritual realm, or do we want to pause here and answer any outlier thoughts or topics from prior?
I'm okay with doing it. I mean, it's a short one. I read it, so I don't know if you'd read it, Maria.
Yeah, I read it. We can do it. That's fine.
All right. So which one of you would like to start?
I'll start with the number 2. A materialistic person cannot understand a spiritual person. Anything that a spiritual person says is fantasy to a materialistic person, because heavenly logic is completely different from the logic of the world. I thought this was interesting. It reminded me of something that I read a long time ago about the nature of belief and doubt, and how you really need to, faith gives understanding in a sense. And the example that was used to illustrate this was that if you look at the stained glass windows, and I just noticed this the other day at St. Basil, if you're standing outside the buildings, the windows look really muddy and dark. But once you're inside, you know, all of the light is shining through and you can see them. They're beautiful. And so that idea of, you know, being within the faith and then gaining understanding and certainty by standing in belief rather than trying to, you know, understand it from the outside is an interesting thing.
Right. I mean, I've seen it in the same idea of, you know, people saying, looking at a tapestry, you know, if you turn a tapestry over, it looks like absolute chaos with all the threads and the strings, everything popping out. But then you turn it over and you see that there is a plan, a pattern that is there. And what this, you know, verse reminds me of is from Scripture, where it says that for the cross is folly to the Jew and foolishness to the Athenian, or to the Greek, showing that basically that what we do, who we are, seems insane if you're outside looking in. But once you're in, then it becomes rational. It makes perfect sense. So for the spiritual person, yeah, it seems like a fantasy. And I've heard that story told me even by Christians, like, it seems like a fantasy story. That this doesn't seem real. This doesn't seem like something that could be. And yet, as you experience it more and more, you realize, wait, that it isn't. And again, how does he say you do that? Not through any kind of, you know, explaining to the other person, but by living it, by bringing that person to Christ through your spiritual reality, kindness, love, etc. It's a beautiful thing. Maria Knell?
The Maxim 3, St. John Chrysostom teaches us that all evil comes first from ourselves and only secondly from the devil. This one was like, oh, geez, you know, I kind of thought of it the other way around, but, you know, we do have ourselves to hold accountable, and we have to keep, you know, our hearts and our minds on God, and that's where the warfare, I guess, comes in.
Exactly. That's the warfare. That's the vigilance.
Yeah.
That's the understanding. Because, you know, I've used the example before about the devil basically using a shotgun to try to wound us with thoughts for us to hopefully latch onto it. But another analogy could be seen looking at it as like a fishing rod, where he's trying to pull out of you something that's deeply in there that he can utilize and twist and nurture into something ugly. You know, there's been countless examples of this, where we see how the way the spiritual world acts. The very first maxim, where the individual was almost led to be hanged. There are many stories that are like that, where when somebody, it's almost like a minor form of possession, or not even minor, because that's the goal. The goal of the demon is to get us to kill ourselves. And by God's grace, where we wake up, or where somebody comes and rescues us to say, stop. Go ahead.
All right, in that situation, let's say Panagia did not come to save him. This man, would he be at fault for that action? Because, I mean, it wasn't really him that was doing it. You know what I mean?
Here, and this goes back to what Elder Thaddeus is talking about, where he says that it starts with us. What that demon did was he was taking already deeply rooted thoughts in the person, because a demon can't just out and out possess you like that to take you on the route. It's only when you give that demon power. So, for example, in the story that I've often quoted, where an individual was in his cell praying, and an angel appeared to him and said, well, I'm going to teach you how to pray even better. And so for weeks he prays with this angel. And then he's sent on an excursion out of the monastery. And as he's walking, suddenly he hears his spiritual father yell at him, stop. He stops and looks down and realizes he was about to walk over a cliff to his death. He goes back to the monastery, asks his spiritual father, what's going on? You know, I heard your voice. And he said, well, I was praying for you at that time. Did anything different happen to you within the last couple of days? And he says, well, not exactly. But then he said, but my angel came to me. You idiot. That was not an angel. That was a demon. And when you put yourself under his care, you allowed yourself to be led this way. So this individual, in all likelihood, was swayed because he was swayable. Whereas if you were vigilant, if you were taking care of yourself, then you would not be led on this. The reality is that suicidal thoughts they're dark thoughts that come from within, that the demons like to nurture. So this person would have been on that path, but for the intercessions of the Virgin Mary that basically allowed him, because maybe he was just on the cusp to be able to know what's going on. Because notice, what did she do to him? She slapped him. Said, "Where are you?" To basically knock him out of the stupor of these suicidal thoughts and bring him back to his family. This is one of the reasons why the Virgin Mary is so important, as we see within this chapter, that she is our intercessor. She is, for all intents and purposes, she's our mama, and she's looking out for us. But, the man would have been responsible for it, even though he was led astray. But that's the same way that we're led astray on everything that we do. But the ultimate goal of that is our destruction, whether it's done through physical death or spiritual death through 1,000 cuts by doing something else. Any final thoughts or comments on this section or any of the sections we've discussed tonight?
No, good discussion.
Yeah, may have been less people tonight, but still very, very rich.
Yes, thank you.
I thank you both for being here.
Thank you, Father.
Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places, filling all things, come and dwell in us, come live, stay, and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Have a blessed and wonderful evening.
You too.